as is the standard these days, I've got a lot to talk about. Save, cleared game data. Sure, why not? Which one should I save it over? This one, I think. 4155. So let me fire the game back up again, and then I can start to talk about my wonderful time with Final Fantasy VI. Because again, there is a lot to say. There always is with these games. But hopefully you guys will enjoy what I have to say. So what happens when I just load this? Do I get to continue exploring the world? Perfect. Okay. This is excellent. So, I think I will just remain here. Kind of look out into the sunset somewhere as I talk about my time with Final Fantasy VI. So, I'm just so glad that it turned out to be really good, because it's one of these things where, once again, for me, it's like another frontier. So I had the moment when I played Final Fantasy IX for the first time, and it was my first playthrough from the PS1 era with no voice acting, and I was a bit worried because I'm like, well, I played Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy 13, and well, that's what I'm used to. Can I make the transition back? Is it going to lose too much of what makes a Final Fantasy game great to me, in the sense that can I still feel everything that I want to feel when I don't have the voice acting to go with it? Final Fantasy IX in that sense was brilliant, because it was a great transition back to the PS1 era. Absolutely loved it. And as I continued my way back, the games did not disappoint. Final Fantasy VIII was amazing, Final Fantasy VII was incredible, and then it came to Final Fantasy VI. So I was like, we're taking yet another step back, all the way to 1994 now. Same questions that I had before I played Final Fantasy IX. Is this too far back now? Is it going to get too primitive? Is it going to work? And of course, you know, a lot of people have said that Final Fantasy VI is one of the greats. A lot of people even have it as their favorite. But of course, for me, it was a bit like, well, maybe these guys are people who, you know, have been playing Final Fantasy since the early 90s, and they have a lot more experience with it. And because I didn't get into Final Fantasy until like 2004, 2005, you know, of people in my sort of era and my sort of story when it comes to Final Fantasy, which titles they played first, and all that kind of stuff, there's maybe going to be less people that have Final Fantasy VI as one of their favorites. But now that I've got to the end of this game, seriously, this has got to be up there as one of the best Final Fantasies ever made. I mean, where do I even begin? I think the best place to begin is probably going to be the cast, because they've clearly put a lot of love and effort into the cast that they created. And you could tell just from that ending sequence alone, where each character got to have like their final goodbye in the story. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And I think I have to say that this cast is probably... it's got to be like the top 3 Final Fantasy casts of all time for me. I mean, I love 10. You know, yes, okay, broken record, but 10 is of course like one of my favorite casts, and as a whole cast, I love the cast of Final Fantasy 7 as well. I think they're great, and so I think these guys are up there with those. I mean, the sheer size of this cast was just insane, and the way that each character was still able to be very individual. They had their own charm, they got to have their own little bits of story, and the way they all had their roles to play, like literally in that final sequence you got to see that they all contributed something to the team. And in that sense I thought that they almost had this impossible task of having such a big cast and keeping things fairly balanced. I think the word that keeps coming back to me when I think about my experience with this game is charm. And for me, up until this point, the most charming Final Fantasy I'd ever played was Final Fantasy IX. The charm of Final Fantasy IX I thought would be unmatched. But Final Fantasy VI, I think, is the game that comes closest or equals it for me in that sense. The fact that all we have is just what you see on screen graphically. I don't know how they did it. Like it's a masterstroke that they were able to inject so much charm and so much feeling into something that has such limitations technologically. Like even things as small as like the little finger wags and, you know, like the little movements that they have, the things that they say, the winks and all these little things, like the way it all added together to create this really charming experience was just absolutely brilliant. And I really, in that sense, I didn't expect it to be so powerful and so good. and the way that filtered through into the characters was just so good. And I think when it came to the characters, the world of Ruin and the way in which they paced the story and the way they managed to juggle such a big cast, I think, again, was just absolutely masterful from a storytelling and developmental standpoint. The way, like, halfway through the game, the world literally changes, you're left on your own, cast away, and your job is to basically round up all of your friends to go and take out Kefka. It's such a beautifully constructed premise, and the way that you find the characters, the way that they keep you on your toes, you don't know exactly who you're going to find and where most of the time. The way they reintegrate, and when they come back into the story, you get like an extra little bit of story about those guys, you get some extra sequences, some extra scenes, some extra flashbacks, and it helps flesh those guys out even more. And I think what they did so well also with this cast was that, obviously, because there were so many of them, they couldn't give them all like crazy in-depth like big stories. So when you think of a cast like, let's say, Final Fantasy VII, and you think of a character like Barret, or, you know, Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, like a lot of these characters, they all have a lot of backstory, a lot of build-up, a lot of flashbacks, you know, and that kind of stuff. Their stories are deep. And I think the depth of the stories of Final Fantasy VI wasn't really that deep relative to smaller casts, and that's just by function of having such a big cast in the first place, I think. Otherwise, I think pacing-wise, the game would suffer if they tried too hard to go too deep into everybody's stories. Now, with that being said, I think what this game really excelled at was they gave us so much with so little that all it took was like a scene sometimes, and you really felt like you knew everything you need to know about a character. So Sabin and Edgar, I think, were a great example. Literally, the scene of what happened to them after their parents' death, and the way they decided who was going to take the throne, and the relationship between them two, I thought was absolutely brilliantly done. And they can convey so much with so little in this game that I felt like I still got to know all the characters well, and I felt like they all had their own personalities, their own stories, their own charm, and that kind of stuff. And the way that they managed to do that for this game was just something that really, really impressed me, and I just enjoyed it so much for that reason. So I think the single biggest thing I probably loved about this game was just the cast and the way they integrated them into the story with so much charm and so much writing mastery. I mean, the pacing of this game, it's been 42 hours, and there is literally only one bit of this game that I can point to where I could say I was feeling a bit annoyed and a bit bored, and that was the optional part in the Nash caves when I had to go like backwards and forwards to do all of that, like finding Amaro, finding Mog, Valid Armada, or whatever the Esper's name was, that sort of stuff. That really dragged on, and I'll get to that aspect of stuff soon. But any time when I was pursuing like the main story, and even like 90% of the side questy stuff that I did, I felt engaged, and I felt interested and invested in the story and the characters. And for me, like, given, again, putting everything into context for how old the game is and how big the cast is, and given what I've played before, I mean, I've literally played Final Fantasy 7 to 10 before I played this, like some of the greatest Final Fantasies ever made in the more modern era as well. To then go even further back, 6 had such an incredibly difficult task to try and live up to those experiences of 7 to 10 that it could have very easily just fallen flat, and it really didn't, and it just did such a fantastic job. So I am super happy with that aspect of things. So alongside that whole thing, I mean, the supporting casts were also brilliant, like even the antagonist side. I mean, you had like someone like General Leo. When you really think about how much they contribute to the story, it wasn't that much. But General Leo just felt super memorable to me, and he was like a really cool character. You had the Emperor, you had, of course, Kefka, you had Sid. And Kefka, for me, I really enjoyed Kefka because a lot of these Final Fantasies have this whole thing where, you know, the antagonists, they try to paint them as more like grey morally by the time you get near the end. Like, some of them, despite all of their reasonings and explanations and their backstories and everything, you still conclude that they're just evil characters, and that's fair, and that's the case for most of the antagonists, because, you know, that's just how they're designed to be in the story most of the time. But I think Final Fantasy VI was one of the ones where Kefka was just a straight up lunatic that had this sort of vision for the world and didn't believe in the value of human life and thought, I just want to end it all and that sort of thing. So let's just compare it to Seymour from Final Fantasy X, who also wanted to end all human life, but his story was much deeper. And you had his whole thing about his childhood, his mother, the fact that in his own twisted way, he wanted to end all suffering by bringing about everyone's death. And you had the whole situation with being unsent in Final Fantasy X, so being dead wasn't really completely being dead. So even though Seymour sounded like a lunatic when he was talking, there was a whole lot more to unpack about what he was saying. A lot more context and a lot more backstory. But with Kefka, it was just like, no, this guy is just a loony, and he just wants to see the world burn. And sometimes you just get people like that, man. Not everybody has these really interesting rationales and philosophical arguments about why they want to do what they want to do. This guy's philosophy was quite simple. We're all going to die anyway. What you do during your life, in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of the cosmos, it really doesn't mean anything. You're going to be forgotten. Your life wouldn't have mattered in the grand scheme. So what the hell's the point? Let's just, I'm just gonna kill everyone because no one matters anyway. And this stuff is a little bit cliche with the whole, we discovered love, and well, love is the reason that we think our lives have value and it gives us meaning, and all that sort of stuff. And it could have struck me as I've played all of these Final Fantasies that came after it chronologically. They did this whole thing a lot better in that sense. They had much more deeper stories, and the antagonists were much more sort of narratively interesting and all that kind of stuff. And the whole love thing could have felt very played out to me by the time I got to this game. But honestly, to me, it just didn't. It just felt like a nice, simple but effective story that tried to use its characters as the crutch rather than sort of the complexity of the narrative and all the philosophies and the messages and all that sort of stuff. And honestly, when it's told this well, with such a great cast in such a great world, with such great pacing and such great charm, that's all you need. That is all you need sometimes, and that's why I love this game for it. And it just did so well in so many different ways. It's one of the most, for me, I would have said Final Fantasy VII. 7 and 10 to me, they feel like some of the best all-rounder Final Fantasies of all time, and I think that's the reason why, in the grander scheme of the Final Fantasy fandom, that's probably why those two Final Fantasies tend to be the biggest and the most loved. And Final Fantasy VII, I remember when I was reviewing it, I said that it felt like a game that just did everything well. It might not have done everything the best, but it did a lot of things extremely well. And I think Final Fantasy VI is another one that was such a great all-rounder. It did everything pretty much really, really well. I mean, the only thing that I could say that probably felt weaker than the other Final Fantasies based on your own personal preference is, perhaps the depth of the story and the depth of the characters that you have. So if you're talking about, how could you make this game even better and make it even closer to being perfection, maybe you could say that potentially they could have fleshed out Kefka more. They could have given Kefka a little more nuance. With some of the central characters, so I'm talking Terra, Celes, Locke, probably those three, and maybe one or two of the other very strong, very important supporting cast members in the story. Maybe they could have gone even deeper with some of those guys, but honestly, that sort of stuff, it feels more like clutching at straws and really nitpicking. I think as an all-rounder game, as a quintessential Final Fantasy game, this game absolutely nails it. It's just got it all. I mean, from the get-go, I love the way they integrated magic into the story. It works well both narratively and also in terms of the gameplay, which I will come to very soon. But narratively, I mean, the whole, the Age of Magic, the War of the Magi, you got the bad guys sort of extracting magic from the Espers to power their own machines, their own military and that kind of thing. But then you've got the more old school magic, and you've got the Espers. There were so many Espers, and the fact that these Espers were brought into the story in such a meaningful and human way, the way that they can communicate. They have their own community, they had their own civilization basically, which is, I think, something that I hadn't really come across now that I try and think about it. I mean, they weren't these sort of creatures that are in the world to sort of aid something to happen sort of thing. I think they really did a good job with that too. And the way the world was constructed, I just felt like they just did so well with bringing together a lot of the Final Fantasy elements that we know and love and weaving it into this really engaging and interesting world that you could have a lot of fun in as well. So all of that stuff I just thought was absolutely brilliant. I have to throw in a word for Ultros. I'm literally wearing the Ultros tee that I got while I'm recording this final session. Ultros this was the first time I properly got to meet Ultros. He was in the Final Fantasy 13-2 Colosseum DLC that I played, but in terms of being the part of like a story, I'd never played 6 before, so this was the first time I got to meet Ultros, and what a hilariously brilliant, it's like antagonist / side character, supporting cast member in the story. I mean, the way that they wrote his character, I think, is so indicative of what makes this game great. That, you know, at the end of the day, he is this, like, you know, purple, gnarly looking magical octopus that can also talk. You know, he has like this weird charm. He's trying to be all like pervy and flirty, and he has like these funny jokes. And then you have like the scene with him and Realm, where suddenly he shows this really vulnerable emotional side because Realm's getting upset about things, and Realm's just a little kid even though they're in the middle of battle. It's just so strange. Like, if you think about it, like, if I was to tell anyone about this sort of character in the story, they would just be like, what the hell? Like, that's just so weird and so random. But it just works so well because of that charm. It just brings it all together. Like, this game had the audacity to give you a boss battle against Ultros where suddenly the boss battle stops because like a 10-year-old character who has an interest in painting wants to paint Ultros and guilt trips him into allowing her to paint him. It's just madness. Like, even talking about this stuff is just hilarious. It's just silly, but somehow the game just makes it work, and I just got so much appreciation for that stuff that it really blew me away, and it really added to the greatness of the experience. So, I mean, like, narratively, world, cast, you know, the Final Fantasy feeling, the vibe that this game gives, like, it's got to be one of the best that I've ever played in that sense, hands down. So that was just, all of that stuff was just really, really great, and I'm so happy about it. So coming to the gameplay, again, better than I thought. I mean, the system is still familiar enough that if you've played, like, you know, 7 to 10, or 7 to 9 even, it's not going to be very alien to you. Having 4 characters was always nice. I think it favours the player a little bit too much, but you got to see that there's definitely more difficult battles where even with 4 characters it doesn't make a huge difference, but in general I do like having 4 characters. And of course, when you consider the fact the cast is so big, having 4 characters was a really good idea, and the way they split the story up and the way they split the party members up at different points of the game to keep everyone engaged in it, I think was also, again, just great planning and great design work by Square. So I think gameplay-wise, again, was it one of the best gameplay-wise? It was one of the better ones, but not like, I wouldn't put it up there as one of the best gameplay-wise. Some things I would say that probably counted against it a little bit in my eyes was the HP and MP. I don't agree with. Like, the HP and MP design should have been different. I think there should have been a much bigger parity between a character like Sabin and a character like Realm, for example. I mean, Sabin basically almost has as much MP as Realm does, and Realm has almost as much HP as Sabin does. I don't think that's a good idea, and I think it would have helped to differentiate the characters through their gameplay a little bit more. So I don't agree with that as a gameplay decision. I think following on from that, also giving everyone the ability to learn every single thing through the story, especially, I don't think is the best idea. So theoretically, you can teach everybody healing spells, you can teach everybody heavy attacking spells, you can teach everybody buffs, you can do all of that stuff for everyone. And especially when you combine the fact that their HP and MP is quite evenly matched, and the fact that magic seems very powerful in the game even if your stat isn't super high, it feels like the characters can kind of cancel each other out, and none of them really stick out too much as like particularly strong in an area if you don't plan it to, or you don't want it to, in that kind of way. So in that sense, I mean, it's ironic because narratively and like the way that they behave in their stories and stuff, each character felt very unique and interesting, but I think gameplay wise, the way that they designed things made them feel a little more muted. So I mean, I had obviously I had Celes, Terra, Realm and Strago as my mages, and obviously due to the weapons and stuff that they can use, they're definitely more magey than physical attackers. But really, I mean, if I really focused on, I don't know, let me just think of someone, Setzer, let's say, and I gave him all of the like relics, all of the equipment, and all of the espers necessary to make him like a mage powerhouse, he's basically just as good a mage as any of those people were that I listed before. And I think especially for the storyline part of the game, I think maybe that took something away and potentially made the game a little bit easier than it should have been. Because for large portions of this game, it really didn't feel very difficult at all. Thankfully, near the end, like the last 10-15 hours, it did pick up in difficulty, and I was definitely much more happy with the difficulty later on. But if I had to kind of criticize it a little bit in that sense, I do think they could have done a little bit better when it comes to individualizing what the characters can do gameplay-wise, and I think that would have contributed to perhaps a better balanced difficulty, especially earlier on in the game as well. So if I had to criticize one thing, it would probably be that. Aside from that, the battle side of the gameplay was fine, it was good fun. I love seeing magic be powerful, it was really good in that sense, you could use a lot of magic. And especially near the end, like with those bigger boss battles, once you learn like Flare and Meteor and Ultima and that kind of stuff, being able to crush these powerful enemies with the big spells, I think was a lot of fun. And a good change-up, because often you tend to rely on like big multi-hit sort of physical attacks and that kind of thing. So seeing this was pretty cool. So being able to use and benefit from magic so heavily, I think was pretty cool. I mean, it's Final Fantasy, I love using magic, and so for me it wasn't like an issue. Aside from that, I think the encounter rate, again, in some of those places I felt like was too high, and the fact that the sprint shoes didn't help you really lower your encounter rate I thought was kind of crap. The fact that Mott is the only character in the game that can get no encounters, again, is not the greatest. I didn't like that either. And so I would say that the single sort of biggest negative of my entire playthrough was the Nash section, and you guys would have noticed that I got a bit annoyed when I was at the like Umaro, Morgue, Valigar Marder, trying to go backwards and forwards through those caves. The way where like you find Morgue and Morgue says, "Come on, let's go to Umaro, I can help," and then suddenly it turns out that Morgue's teleported to the airship. So you go all that distance, you fight or try to run from all those enemies, and it turns out that Morgue's not even there. So, you know, these sort of little annoying mechanical things definitely could have been better. And, you know, it did make some, like, little segments of the game more annoying than they should have been. But overall, I mean, I don't think I needed to flee enough that the annoyingness of fleeing really impacted me, like, in any major way. I would say maybe only 3 to 5% of the actual gameplay was affected by how annoying the fleeing was and the high encounter rate and all that sort of stuff. But since the game was already so great, of course I have to also pick up on the little things that did annoy me too. And so that's something that I can definitely point to that I wasn't really in love with in that sense. I think side quest variety wise they did a good job, because it's hard to judge in terms of side quests, because I personally think that the idea of being able to go to the final battle without your cast is silly, and the fact that it's designed like that, like they're designed in a way where you can do that, is something that I disagree with, because I mean, imagine that whole finale with only like 5 of your cast members instead of everyone. Like, that would really suck. So I think the game should have pretty much forced the players to get your main cast members back. You know, at least obviously, like, you don't have to get Umaro, Go-Go, maybe Morgue, Shadow if you didn't save him. So it could have been maybe like 7 or 8 characters, but like being able to go in there with potentially 3, 4, 5 is not something that I think was a great idea. That being said, I think most players would have done what I did and would have gone around the world and tried to collect everybody anyway. And I think, I mean, technically, like, even though they're main party members, because they're missable for like the final bit, I don't know if that counts as really like side questing or not. So it's kind of difficult to say. For me, it doesn't really seem like a side quest. So, you know, going to get Realm back at Owl's mansion, to me, that shouldn't be a side quest. But I guess in the most technical sense it is, because it's not optional. Sorry, because it's optional for the main story. So it's hard to judge. But was there a lot to do outside of just like the main core narrative? Yes. Again, I was worried because I thought this is an older game. Maybe they just couldn't pack as much stuff in to do, like as they did for some of the later games. But in that sense, I was satisfied. There was a lot of espers to find. There's a lot of like little caves to visit and things to unlock, and things to see and that sort of stuff. So I was pretty impressed with that too. And of course it's not over yet, because we still have a few more little things to do. I think there's 5 espers that I need to get, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure, but there's I think, wait, not 5, it might be 4 more espers. And then I think I have to do I think there's either 1 or 2 extra dungeons that I have to do as a result of this being the Game Boy Advance version. So, I mean, the content isn't even finished. I'm 42 hours in and I still have some more to do. And for me, that's plenty. And again, I think because of the nature of the time and the way the game is, a lot of the side quests are more to just do with like either stories or battles in caves and dungeons and that kind of stuff. And for me, that's perfect. There's only 2 things I generally want from a side quest. I either want more story or I want more battles. And sometimes, obviously, if the best side quest, they have both. And I think this game does well with that stuff. There's not really any fetch quests to do. It's always like, go to this cave or go to this area, fight some monsters and either get an item or find out a bit of story, find a character, and that kind of thing. So the side quests suited me perfectly fine, and I've definitely enjoyed the variety and the amount we've had so far. The sheer number of espers alone is already like an indication of how much there is to do in that sort of sense. Is it one of the best in terms of side quests? Can it compete with the likes of Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy XII, those sort of games that I think did really well with side quests? No, I don't think it's that level. But when it comes to side quests, I think it's perfectly serviceable. And again, considering the context of when it was made, I think it's not something I'm going to criticize, and something that overall I'm definitely putting down as a plus for the game. I think technically, again, the soundtrack is just another one of those like Uematsu masterpieces. You can just see why he's the godfather of Final Fantasy music. So when it comes to the tracks themselves, I mean, there were some really, really great ones. I mean, of course, near the end, Kefka's, like the battle against Kefka, Dancing Mad is like an iconic, amazing Final Fantasy track. I really like the one that they use with Ultimate Weapon as well. I don't know exactly what the name of that theme is, but I thought that was a really good one. You had like even things like Edgar and Sabin's theme, like when you enter the castle and stuff, it's just so... It had the sort of Final Fantasy VII-ness in the sense of the music and the areas just became so synonymous with each other. And I think when they become so closely tied to each other, where just instantly hearing a few notes kind of takes your mind to where that area is. The best example I have for that is like Cosmo Canyon. I feel like Cosmo Canyon is one of those places where you hear it for like a few seconds and you're instantly taken away to Cosmo Canyon as an area. And I think Final Fantasy VI did that pretty well as well. I think Final Fantasy VII is the king when it comes to the soundtracks for being able to do that particular thing. But Final Fantasy VI had a lot of good stuff in that sense as well. I mean, there was also the opera section, which was really unique and interesting. Obviously not come across anything like that before, and listening to the opera, and that whole segment was really memorable for me as well. So soundtrack wise, I think they did a great job. A lot of the different areas had really well-fitting music. The icy areas, the caves, the boss battles, the sort of more mellow, more romantic moments, the castles. So I think soundtrack-wise, it was definitely up there as one of the great ones as well. And I'm very pleased with that aspect of it, of course, but it very rarely ever disappoints anyway. But of course, it's still worth pointing out that it's definitely one of the better soundtracks as well in the series. It's just another box to tick in terms of this Final Fantasy being such a great all-rounder. Again, I think in terms of like scope, size of the game, the way things look, I adapted to it pretty quickly. I think I didn't have too much of a problem with it. I think probably like everything, again, the sprites, the way that they have like these little animations and that kind of thing, they did a lot with what they had, and they were still able to do a pretty good job of conveying feeling and emotion and like humor and all that sort of stuff. So I think technically they did about as well as you could reasonably expect from a 1994 game on the Famicom/SNES. An area where probably I think the technical side of things might have made life more difficult is sometimes I think this game suffered a little bit from the whole sort of you're a team and you're traveling around as like as a party/group, but you didn't really have all of them or like enough of them appearing in scenes and moments and conversing about stuff all the time. And I think that's probably a limitation of the times, I would say. So like there'd be certain moments where you'd expect like, more of the party to be there, or for them to sort of feel like they're a team and they're in it together. Like for the finale, literally seeing them all on screen and having their own quotes and that sort of stuff was epic. But they kind of saved that right for the end. there weren't a huge amount of moments earlier on where, like, even though that you had like your 4 party members, either they weren't on screen at the same time when they could have been, or they didn't really have anything to say or like talk about when it came to like a story situation or like a character story. So in that sense, perhaps it was a little more limited as well due to the times, but it was definitely not enough for me to say, oh, you know, this made the game worse, or, you know, it was really bad or anything like that. But again, it's just something that I noticed while I was playing through. So, I think I've talked about pretty much everything I want to talk about, and I'm just, you know, overall I would have to say that this has made life really difficult for me, because I've been getting away with sort of tiering Final Fantasy 7 to 9 in the same sort of tier. I find those games so hard to differentiate from each other in terms of which one I like best and which one I would rank above the other. So I tend to kind of just say 7 to 9 are sort of in their own like little tier below Final Fantasy 10. But I have to add Final Fantasy 6 to that one as well, because it's so good. I mean, I can't say it's categorically better than Final Fantasy 7, 8 and 9, but I can't really say it's worse either. So honestly, for me, it's just been so hard. Like, I have to just operate a tier system now in my head because I just can't rank them anymore. I just could not say... I just couldn't do it. Like, if you put a gun to my head and like I really have to, then yeah, I'm sure I would, but the heart just says no. Like, to me, they all just feel like A-tier Final Fantasy games, where Final Fantasy X is my like S-tier, God-tier Final Fantasy game, and then below that tier is 6 to 9. And then after that, you've got the likes of like Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 12, Final Fantasy 15, and those kind of games. So 6 definitely joins the pantheon of greats when it comes to Final Fantasy X. Like, if there was a Mount Rushmore of Final Fantasy games, I think 6 would definitely be on it. It was a great experience, and I really, really enjoyed pretty much my entire time with it. So that is all I have to say about Final Fantasy 6. And I do want to dedicate a little bit of extra time to you guys, the viewers, for this one, because this series absolutely blew me away in terms of like the reception that it got and the interest it got. Like, pretty much no other series, even Final Fantasy X did, when I first uploaded that LP back in 2014. So when it came to Final Fantasy 6 again, I was a little bit like, you know, we're going really far back in time. It's an old game on an old system. You know, are people going to start to lose interest in this sort of thing? Are we going too far back for people to still be engaged? Because I feel like there's going to be an increasingly large number of people, I think, that are watching that wouldn't have played the game originally, and that's going to happen more and more the further back I go, I think. So for this one, I was thinking it's probably not going to perform that well in terms of, like, you know, the views and maybe the likes and that sort of stuff. But seriously, like, the interest in this series has been absolutely insane. You know, the views part 1 got and the reception that it got, it's almost up to 1,000 likes now. It's been about 2 months since I uploaded it. It's almost up to 1,000 likes. It has like over 20,000 views already, and there's just been so much love and so much positive energy. And I think the Final Fantasy VI fan base probably has to be one of the best sort of fan bases I've encountered. I've had so many people just write nice messages and just let me know that they're really enjoying the series and really loving the game. And it's just been an absolute pleasure. It really, really has. I think, like, when it's all said and done, it's got to be one of the best series I've uploaded onto the channel, because not only did I love the game, you guys clearly love the game. It performed really, really well, like, relative to what I thought it would. And, you know, I think in terms of like the general energy surrounding it and the vibe that it has, it's got to be one of the most positive and well-loved games I think I've covered on the channel. So thank you all so much for joining me on this journey, for supporting the channel. Everyone that's supporting me on Patreon and everyone that's like following me on social media, dropping likes and retweets and sharing it and writing nice messages to say how much you're enjoying it. I always say it, but for me, this is what makes my job worth doing. Of course, I love playing the games and all that kind of stuff, all of the perks that come with doing what I do. But honestly, like, when you know that what you're doing is being appreciated and people are enjoying themselves and you're entertaining people, that's really where the value is, and that's where the meaning is in what I do. So thank you all so much. Really, really appreciate it. We still have more to come from this playlist. There's going to be probably not a huge amount, but probably like maybe 3 episodes, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes to come. But once we're done with that, that is another Final Fantasy in the books. So we have 6 to 15 now covered on the channel. It's becoming quite the archive. We're not going to stop there, of course. We're going to continue going further back in time, and I will be playing Final Fantasy V next on the channel in terms of Final Fantasy stuff. As for when, no idea. I don't know how long this play is going to be. I don't know how long it's going to take to upload, but it's going to be a few months probably at least from when I'm recording this particular session. But rest assured, it will happen, and I hope you guys enjoy that one as well. It doesn't seem to quite have the following and the love that 6 does, but at least for Final Fantasy 4 and 5, I'm still confident that they'll be decent games and that we should still really enjoy them. But I'll do my best regardless. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I've had to, again, my quote-unquote voice acting got put through its paces here with so many characters and so much dialogue and so much shouting. Again, as always, I did my best with that stuff. Do my best to kind of read it with a little bit of feeling, a little bit of emotion where I can, you know, try and do all the shouting and the grunting and all that kind of stuff as best I can. But it's always a challenge, but I've been enjoying it so far, and I've got a fair bit of experience with that sort of stuff under my belt now. So thank you all so much for joining me. It has truly been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you guys for more Final Fantasy very soon. Take care.